Hello, my name is Eric Troutman, and I'm going to be teaching you about making contributions to open source projects. So for our example today, we'll be using the Odin project, which you can see it's an open source curriculum for learning web development, and the curriculum is actually on GitHub, so we can see it right here. And so the question is, if you want to make a change to this curriculum, how do you do it? In the previous video, we covered the really basic way of doing it, where you can basically just open up a file, hit edit, and you can edit it right on GitHub. That's not entirely appropriate if you want to make more substantial changes, particularly if you want to make changes to a project that isn't just a bunch of markdown files but actually involves some real code. So today what we're going to cover is sort of the more realistic workflow for those types of use cases. So the very first thing I want to take a look at here is this diagram. And if you take nothing away from this video, just try to remember this diagram. It's basically the triangle model of Git. It's just the way that I think about things. So what you have here is you have the original repository sitting up on GitHub. So that's what we just took a look at. So that's sitting right here. This is the original repo that you actually want to make a contribution to. And so what you're going to need to do is, because you don't actually have access to this repository to actually push changes to it yourself, what you need to do is basically make a copy of it for yourself. And so that's called forking. So you basically fork the repo over here to make a copy of it on GitHub. And then so if you actually want to work on that repo, you need to bring it back down onto your local computer, which is, let's say it's got this little laptop icon. And you do that by cloning it down onto your local fork. And so when you're done making changes, what you want to do is, again, you can't push it directly up to the upstream repository here. So you need to push it back to your fork version, and then from your fork version, you're going to use GitHub's really easy to use interface and just submit a pull request to the original upstream repository. And basically what that means is you're just asking the person who owns the repository, the upstream, hey, I've made some changes. I think these would be good inclusions to the project. Please pull them into your project for me, since I don't have access to do that. And so we'll go over this whole process, but basically the point here is that you kind of think of it as a triangle. And so here we have two sides of the triangle, where you fork the upstream repository, and that's called the origin, and you clone that down to your local computer. You work on that there, and then when you're done with that, you'll push it back up to your fork, and then you'll submit a pull request to the original upstream repository. So that's the basics of the flows. We'll cover a little bit of nuance in just a sec, but first I just wanted to do that and just show you how it's done. So here we are. This is the original repository. I've signed in, so I'm signed into an account that's not the owner of the repository, so I can actually fork it. And so what you do is you go up here on the right, there's this fork button, boom. Alright, there we go. Instantaneously, we are now on the fork of our repository. You can see it's learn by building /curriculum instead of the Odin project /curriculum. So in our diagram, now we're over here in the origin. And so what we need to do is we need to take this repository and bring it back down into our local computer so we can actually work on it. So we're going to clone it. So what we do is, what we need is a clone URL. And so you can get that on the right hand side here. There's a couple different methods you can use. You can use SSH or HTTPS. If one fails, just try the other. I'm going to use SSH. It just changes the URL that it hooks up to. Click that button to copy it to the clipboard. I'll go into the terminal. So I want to bring this down into my local computer first. I'm going to cd into my documents. I created a test directory. So now I'm in my test directory. There's nothing in it, nothing interesting in it. And so I'm going to clone this repository directly into it. And so that's going to be git clone that. And so what this is doing is it's copying all those files from my forked version right up here onto my local computer so I can actually work on them. Great. So now I can do an ls and I can see the contents. So now there's a folder that's called curriculum, and so I can cd into it. ls. Now you can see it's got all the files of the curriculum. Great. Why don't we make some changes to one? So open it up in Sublime Text. Let's say I'm going to do the README. I'm not actually going to submit this, so I can just mess around a little bit. hi, I am an important change. Save it, go to the terminal, and so we can do a git status. And so we've modified the README. And as you know from your Git workflow, we're going to do a git add. So now if we do git status, we'll see that it's in the staging. So it's getting ready to be committed. And so we can do a git commit and say important change made. Got it. Great. So now we're ready. We've made our important changes. So we just push it right back up to our forked version, right? Well, this is actually where things get a little bit. You need to pause for just a second, because one of your underlying assumptions when you're working with Git is that you should assume that the original upstream repository is constantly changing. So in particular, as the owner of this particular one that we're taking a look at, I know that I'm submitting changes and I'm accepting pull requests multiple times a day. So this repository is constantly changing. So what you need to assume is that as soon as you've made a fork of that repository, the original repository has changed and moved on, and your fork is out of date. And so that means that you need to actually take a look at a slightly different workflow. So what we're adding here is what we need to do is we need to take those changes that we know have occurred in the upstream repository and we need to get them into our local fork. Otherwise, if we submitted a pull request over to the upstream repo, it would be out of date and it wouldn't work. So the way that we do that is we complete the triangle by adding our third leg. And remember, we can't actually push directly from our local version up to upstream, but what we can do is we can pull down from upstream to the local version, and that's how we update our local version to make sure that it's current. And so we do that by adding the upstream repository as what's called a remote. And so all a remote is it's just it just tells your local Git, hey, by the way, like this is the upstream repository. Whenever you clone down a repo, you'll already have an origin, a remote that's called origin. So it's pretty cool. You can take a look. You see git remote. Look, you've already got origin sitting right here. So that was just part of the cloning process. Git already does that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a second remote that points to the upstream repository so that we can start talking to it and getting data from it. So what we need to do is a very similar thing to what we had before. Is we went to the original repository. So we can go back to the original. We can open that in a new tab because you see that it's forked from and it gives you a nice link. So now we're in the original Odin project /curriculum, and we do the same thing. We grab that URL from the right side. We say, all right, copy that to the clipboard. So we go back to our terminal, we do git remote add, and then we need to name it. We'll call it upstream, because that's the convention, and then we'll give it the URL. So now it doesn't tell you anything when it's successful. Type git remote, and now we've got two remotes. We've got origin, which is our fork. We've got upstream, which is the main repository, which is the original repository. So now we need to do a little bit of magic here. So what we did is we just did the stuff in green here. We just added the upstream. And so now if we want to update our local fork, or sorry, our local clone, we need to pull in changes from the upstream. So what we can do is we can do a git pull upstream and then into the master branch. So you specify the branch. Say, great. All right, we're already up to date. Good stuff. We got lucky. There were no changes in the meantime. And so here what you do is you'd continue on with your normal workflow. But one thing I want to highlight, which is a slightly more explicit way of doing this, and so this might be a little bit confusing for people who aren't necessarily too familiar with Git, and you might just say, close your ears and move on about a minute from now. But it's also really illustrative of what's actually going on, because sometimes when you do a pull, it just sort of happens, and you go, oh my goodness, what actually happened? Well, here what we can also do is we can do a fetch. So what a pull is it's a fetch plus a merge. So we can also do that. We can do a fetch and then a merge. Git fetch upstream. And so what this does is it goes and it grabs everything from that upstream remote and it records them as different branches locally. So we can do git branch. Oh, where are those? Well, actually, they're basically hidden branches. They're hidden off to the side. So if you do a git branch a, there they are. So we've got these other branches that are sitting there. And so what we did when we did a fetch is we updated these branches from the upstream. So now there's a hidden branch which has all those changes that, well, I mean, we know that there aren't any changes because we just saw that, but there's an upstream branch that has all these changes, and it's sitting off to the side. So we haven't done anything with it. It hasn't changed what we're looking at on our computer. You know, if we do a git status, there's nothing except wait, we're ahead of origin master by 1 commit. So now it knows because it knows what origin master is. But okay, so what we do, the second half of that, so we've fetched down all these branches, and now we can kind of see where they are using that git branch a flag, which shows all the branches. And so now all we have to do is a git merge, and then specify the exact branch, upstream master. And it's going to merge it into whichever branch we're currently on, which is master. Well, we're already up to date, otherwise there would be changes. But so what we just did, git fetch upstream plus git merge upstream master, is the exact same thing as the git pull upstream that we did. Actually, I believe it was git pull upstream master. So it's the same thing. It's just a little bit more explicit, and so as you get a little bit more advanced with how you use Git, you can start poking around and you can actually look into this branch and say, hey, wait, what are these changes that I'm about to be pulling in, and things like that, and you can be a little bit more selective. But anyway, so now we know that we're up to date. So let's go back to our diagram. So great, we added our remote, we pulled down changes, our local clone is officially up to date, and we're ready to go. Now it's time to start pushing things back up and do a pull request to the original repository. So I'm going to go back to my terminal. So I know I'm up to date, so I'm going to do git push origin, because remember I don't have access to upstream. So I'm going to push it back to origin, and I'm going to push the master branch. Now this isn't really going to work because my computer's not set up correctly, because I'm kind of trying to juggle a couple different accounts. See, I don't have access rights, but let's assume that that worked. Let's assume that I just pushed my upstream branch up to GitHub. So now I go back to my fork, and so now I'm on my fork. And what I can do is here, we have this thing called compare review and create a pull request. So let's just assume that I got that all the changes are pushed. So now this repo is slightly ahead of the upstream repo. So I would do a pull request, and there would be comparisons here that I would actually see, because right now they're identical, because again, it didn't work. I wasn't actually able to push my changes up. But all you do is you'd see that there's changes here to be made. There would be a button here that says, submit pull request, like you're good to go. You type in a message, and you click that, and it gets sent right over to the original repository owner. And so then the original repository owner is going to get an email. He's going to see his pull requests, bump up by 1. He's going to go in here and he's going to click on the pull request, and he'll look over your changes and decide whether or not you're worthy of inclusion into the repository. So basically, what we've done here today is this workflow, is the git triangle workflow, as we say. We start with the upstream repository. We have to make a fork of it because we don't have access to change it, and then we have to clone that fork onto our local machine because we obviously can't work directly off the GitHub one. So we make our changes here. Then we have to pull any updates from the upstream repository because ours is probably out of date. You just always assume that you're out of date. So you pull changes from upstream. Once you know that you're current, your changes are all merged in, you're good to go, push it back up to your forked repository, which is origin, and then you go up onto github.com and you just click that pull request button, real easy, and you've submitted a pull request to the upstream repository. And then maybe that'll start a conversation with the repo owner who's going to say, well, wait a second, that isn't exactly what I was hoping for, but if you make these changes, you can, I'll accept it, or maybe he'll just accept it right away. So that, in a nutshell, is how you make a contribution to an open source project. So I hope you'll do it, and good luck from here. Let me know if there's anything I can do better. Cheers.